Jamie too had worked his entire life to get to where he was. At 45, he was proud of the two-story home he'd built from scratch in Chandler, Arizona. His backyard was his pride and joy, palm trees lining the fence, the crystal-clear pool in the center, and a sanctuary that allowed him to escape the noise of the world. He bought it himself, no shortcuts, no handouts, just years of grinding, saving, and making smart choices. Jamie wasn't the social type. His neighborhood was mostly families, a mix of older and newer homeowners, and while some folks were friendly, most kept to themselves. That suited him just fine. He wasn't interested in being the life of the block. He just wanted peace, quiet. His backyard was his place of solitude. But peace, as it often does, didn't last. It started small. One Saturday afternoon, Jamie came home from running errands and noticed something off. Wet footprints, leading from his backyard gate to the sidewalk. At first, he thought maybe the landscaper had been by, or some utility worker. But as he walked closer, he saw it, a dripping towel carelessly thrown over his fence. That's when his stomach sank. The water level in his pool was lower than it should have been. His pool float had been moved, and there, right next to the lounge chair, was a half-empty soda can. Someone had been in his yard. For a moment, Jamie stood frozen, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe a kid had jumped the fence, gotten caught in the act, and bolted without thinking. But deep down, he knew better. He knew what this was. Someone had crossed the line. After a quick search of the neighborhood, Jamie got nothing but careless shrugs from his neighbors. Probably just one of the kids, one woman said with a laugh. You know how they are. Another neighbor, a man who barely looked up from his car, muttered, they're just having fun. You got a nice pool, Jamie. People notice. That last comment left a bitter taste in Jamie's mouth, but he said nothing. He just locked the gate and hoped it wouldn't happen again. But it did. A week later, Jamie was sitting in his living room, relaxing with a beer, when he heard splashing coming from the backyard. At first, he thought it was the pool filter, but then he heard laughter. He walked to the back door and peeked outside. His blood ran cold. In his pool were two teenagers, one a boy, the other a girl, swimming like they owned the place. The boy was splashing around, grinning, while the girl sat on the edge of the pool, dipping her feet in the water. Jamie flung the door open. Hey! The kids froze, their eyes widening in shock. The boy scrambled out of the pool, his feet slipping on the wet concrete. I thought we'd just cool off for a bit, the boy stammered. Jamie's voice was tight with anger. You didn't think to ask. The girl mumbled something about living 2 houses down before the two of them bolted, running out the gate without another word. Jamie stood there, fists clenched. His pulse was racing. He didn't want to make a scene, but this was too far. He walked back inside, trying to calm himself, but the seed of frustration had already been planted. The next day, Jamie went to confront the kids' parents. He expected an apology, or at least some acknowledgement of how out of line their kids had been. But instead, he found himself in the middle of an argument. Oh, come on, Jamie, the mother scoffed. They're just kids. It's hot out. What's the big deal? Jamie's jaw tightened. The big deal, he repeated, is that this is my property, my home, my pool, and I don't remember handing out invitations. The father, arms crossed, muttered something under his breath. You're being dramatic. Dramatic. Jamie's voice rose. This is my space, and if I want it respected, I don't think I'm asking for too much. But the conversation was over before it had even begun. They left with no apology, just a dismissive shrug, as if Jamie's frustration was nothing more than an overreaction. Jamie didn't waste any time. He installed security cameras around his property, hoping that would put a stop to it. But, of course, that didn't last long. 2 weeks later, it was happening again. One afternoon, Jamie came home to find his side gate, always locked, slightly ajar. The sick feeling returned in his stomach. As he rounded the corner of the yard, he froze. His backyard was full of people. Not just kids this time, but adults too, families, friends, all lounging around as if they were at some public pool. Some had chairs set up, others were sipping drinks, and a couple of women were wading in his pool. Jamie blinked, unsure for a moment whether he was seeing things. Was this real? His mind raced as he scanned the group. That's when he locked eyes with Sandra, one of his neighbors from 3 houses down. She waved at him like they were old friends. "Hey, Jamie. Hope you don't mind," she called out. "It's so hot today. We figured we'd cool off in your pool." Jamie's jaw clenched, and his patience snapped. "Mind? I do mind. I mind a lot," he shouted, striding forward. "This is my pool. My house. My yard. And none of you are invited." Some people froze. Others looked confused. Sandra, ever the entitled neighbor, scoffed. "Oh, come on. It's just a pool. You weren't even home." Jamie's anger flared. "It's not just a pool, Sandra. It's mine. Get out. Now." One person muttered, "Geez, what's her problem?" That was it. Jamie stormed to the pool equipment box, grabbed the remote for the pool filter, and shut it off. The speakers that were playing music, he yanked the power cord out. "I'm calling the police," he announced, his voice cold. Immediately, people started scrambling. Towels were wrapped up, drinks snatched off the ground, and in less than a minute, the yard was empty. Sandra, though, had the audacity to roll her eyes as she walked past. "You don't have to be so uptight," she muttered under her breath. Nobody was hurting anything. Jamie slammed the gate behind them, locked it, and stood there, seething with anger. He had tried to be reasonable. He had tried to be polite. But this was a whole new level of disrespect, and it wasn't something he would tolerate. And as he stood there in the silence of his backyard, Jamie knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next move was his. And it would make sure they would never forget to respect his boundaries again. Jamie stood at the locked gate, his fists clenched. The adrenaline from the confrontation still buzzed in his veins. For months, he had been calm, patient, trying to reason with people who clearly didn't understand the value of boundaries. But now, Jamie was done playing nice. He wasn't about to let anyone take advantage of him again, not in his own home. As he walked back to the house, his mind started working. This couldn't be another incident brushed under the rug. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was determined. He had to send a message that couldn't be ignored. The next morning, Jamie made his plan. The first step was obvious. He needed better security. He wasn't about to rely on a flimsy lock and a few cameras anymore. No, this needed to be unbreakable. He drove to the local hardware store and picked up 2 heavy-duty locks, one for the side gate, the other for the pool equipment box. The old locks had been strong, but these were on a whole different level. He wasn't messing around. After that, he went online and ordered something a little less conventional. A pool die. It was harmless but highly effective, a trick used by public pools to expose rule breakers. The dye would turn the water a bright, fluorescent green if anyone peed in it, marking them for everyone to see. He smiled to himself, imagining the look on their faces when they realized what had happened. Jamie didn't stop there. He wanted to make sure no one thought this was just a prank. He went to a local sign shop and had a custom warning made. Warning: pool chemically treated for unauthorized use. Exposure may cause rash, severe itching, or temporary skin discoloration. He made sure to place the sign where it could be seen clearly from the street, and for good measure, he set an empty hazardous chemical container near the pump. It looked official. It looked dangerous. He was betting no one would be brave enough to test it. Later that day, he sat by his window, iced tea in hand, watching the world go by. The sun blazed in the sky, and the heat shimmered off the sidewalk. He could feel the tension in the air. He had done everything to make sure no one dared set foot in his backyard again. Now, he just had to wait. And it didn't take long. By the afternoon, he saw 2 teenagers walking past his house. They stopped at the gate, glancing at the warning sign. One of them whispered something to the other. Both of them took a step back, and without another word, they turned around and walked away. Jamie leaned back in his chair and let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. They had seen the sign, and they were already scared off. His plan was working. He was getting his peace back. But as he checked his phone later that evening, he saw Sandra's name pop up in a neighborhood Facebook group. FYI, the post began, "Looks like Jamie put some kind of weird chemical in his pool. Says it causes rashes and skin issues. Not sure how safe that is. Just a heads up." Jamie clicked on the post and read through the comments that followed. OMG. What if it leaks into the ground? That doesn't sound legal. Why does he even care so much? It's just water. Isn't that overreacting a little? Jamie couldn't help but laugh aloud. They weren't mad because of the lie or the chemical. They were mad because they realized their free ride was over. They couldn't just walk into his backyard whenever they felt like it anymore. But the best part? No one had dared to step foot in his yard since. The days of freeloaders swimming in his pool, ignoring his boundaries, were over. Jamie finally had the peace he'd been craving. That night, as he sat back and reflected on how well things had gone, he thought about what would come next. He was finally taking control. But Sandra wouldn't just let this go. He knew she would come knocking soon enough. And he was ready. The final piece of the puzzle was just around the corner. Jamie had taken the first step, but he wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Jamie's victory was sweet, but he knew it wouldn't last forever. Sandra's Facebook post had stirred up a storm in the neighborhood, and Jamie wasn't naive enough to think she'd just let it slide. She was the kind of person who thrived on drama, and now that she had something to use against him, it was only a matter of time before she came knocking on his door again. That night, as he lay in bed, Jamie ran through every possible scenario in his mind. He wasn't worried about the threats in the post. He was confident in the legality of his actions. What bothered him more was the tone of Sandra's message. She wasn't just upset. She was trying to turn the neighborhood against him. He couldn't let that happen. He wasn't going to let anyone make him feel like the bad guy in his own home. The next morning, just like he expected, there was a sharp knock on his door. Jamie froze, staring at the front door for a moment. He knew it was Sandra. He had prepared himself, but now that it was happening, he felt the weight of the situation press down on him. He opened the door slowly. There she was, arms crossed, her face twisted in irritation. Sandra didn't waste any time. "We need to talk," she said, her voice sharp. Jamie took a deep breath, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Do we?" Sandra didn't take the bait. She stepped forward. "What the hell do you think you're doing? People are scared to even walk past your house now. You're ruining everything. You can't just throw chemicals in your pool and expect no one to notice." Jamie leaned against the door frame, his gaze steady. "I'm doing exactly what I need to do to protect my property. You and your friends have ignored my boundaries for long enough. This is my home, Sandra, not a community pool." She scoffed, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're ridiculous. It's just water. No one cares that much about a pool. You don't even have kids. Why do you care so much?" Jamie's patience was wearing thin. He took a step forward, his voice hard. "Just because I don't have kids doesn't mean I should let people walk all over me. You think because I'm single and don't have a family, I don't deserve my privacy? I don't think so." Sandra opened her mouth to argue, but Jamie cut her off. "You don't pay for my water bill, you don't clean my pool, and you sure as hell don't get to decide who uses it. You're not entitled to any of this." Sandra's face flushed with anger. "You're just upset because no one likes you. Maybe if you weren't so uptight, you'd actually have friends." Jamie's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I don't need your approval, Sandra. I'm not here to win a popularity contest. I'm here to make sure no one walks all over me, and that includes you." Sandra seemed taken aback for a moment. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her face growing redder by the second. She had no more words. Instead, she threw her hands up in the air in frustration. "You know what? Forget it," she spat, turning on her heel. "Enjoy your little fortress. You're gonna be the weird neighbor forever." As she stormed off, Jamie couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made threats. He'd simply stood his ground, and it was clear that it had shaken her. She wasn't used to anyone standing up to her. But even as Sandra disappeared down the street, Jamie knew that this wasn't the end. She would talk, spread rumors, and try to turn people against him. He could already imagine her telling the rest of the neighbors how unreasonable he was being. But this time, he was ready. Sandra had shown her hand, and now it was time for him to play his. Later that evening, Jamie sat in his living room, the silence of his home a welcome change from the chaos outside. He checked his phone. Sure enough, Sandra had already posted in the neighborhood Facebook group again, and this time, the message was more hostile than before. "FYI, Jamie's gone off the deep end. He's not letting anyone near his pool now. Beware of the chemicals he's throwing in there. I'm just saying, maybe we should all keep an eye on him." Jamie smiled darkly to himself. This was exactly what he'd been expecting. He wasn't naive enough to think Sandra wouldn't try to rally the neighbors against him. But what she didn't realize was that she was playing right into his hands. In the morning, Jamie went to the local community center and made a few inquiries. He was friendly, calm, nothing like the image Sandra had painted of him. He simply wanted to make sure everyone in the neighborhood knew what had really happened. By the time he left, he had a few key supporters who had heard the full story and agreed that Sandra was overstepping. The tides were turning. The next day, Jamie decided to escalate things a little further. He put up a second sign on his fence, this one a bit more official looking than the last. It read, "Private property. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. And this time, he made sure it was more visible than ever before. That afternoon, Jamie watched as people walked by, glancing at the sign. No one stopped anymore, not even to gossip. The fear was real now. But just as Jamie started to feel that sense of relief creeping in, the doorbell rang. It was Sandra, again. But this time, there was something different in her eyes. She wasn't angry. She wasn't shouting. She looked desperate. "I just wanted to apologize," she said, her voice quiet. "I was out of line. I shouldn't have involved the whole neighborhood. I just wanted people to see that you're being unreasonable." Jamie stared at her for a moment, unsure of whether to trust the change in her tone. But then, he realized something. She wasn't there because she felt guilty. She was there because she was scared. Scared of losing control over the situation. "No hard feelings," Jamie said flatly, opening the door wider. "Just make sure you respect the boundaries next time." As he closed the door behind her, Jamie finally felt like the power had shifted. Sandra wasn't in control anymore. He was. And the best part? He knew the neighborhood would never be the same again. Sandra's apology, if you could even call it that, hung in the air long after she left. Jamie didn't know what was more unsettling. The fact that she had come to him with a half-hearted apology, or that it didn't seem to matter much to her that she'd crossed a line. What mattered now was that she knew the game had changed. Jamie had made his point loud and clear. The boundaries had been set, and he wasn't backing down. But even though he felt victorious in the moment, he couldn't shake the feeling that Sandra and the others were still out there, simmering with resentment. What if they didn't give up? What if they tried again? He knew that he couldn't afford to get complacent. For the next few days, Jamie kept his eyes peeled. He didn't relax his vigilance. He had worked too hard to build the life he wanted, and he wasn't about to let anyone disrupt his peace again. But as the days passed, the tension started to ease. No more wandering kids by the fence. No more suspicious glances from the neighbors. The neighborhood, for the most part, seemed to have gotten the message. Then one evening, as he sat on his back porch enjoying a quiet sunset, the doorbell rang once more. Jamie's stomach tightened. His first instinct was to groan, thinking it was Sandra again. He stood up, walked to the door, and opened it, prepared for another round. But this time, it wasn't Sandra. Standing there was a man he hadn't seen before, middle-aged, with a friendly but cautious smile. He extended his hand. "Hey there, I'm Steve," he said, his tone polite but a little unsure. "I live a few houses down from you. I know things have been a little tense around here lately, and I just wanted to say, I think you did the right thing. I've seen what's been going on with the pool, and honestly, I don't blame you." Jamie blinked, taken aback. Was this real? A neighbor actually speaking up in his defense? Thank you," Jamie replied cautiously, still not sure where this conversation was headed. Steve went on. "I've lived here for years, and I've seen a lot of nonsense go down in this neighborhood. But what happened to you? It's just ridiculous. People think they are entitled to everything, but your place is yours, and they shouldn't be treating you like that. You're not the only one who's been pushed around." Jamie raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "So you're on my side?" Steve chuckled softly. "Well, I don't know about all that, but I do know one thing. People around here respect the ones who stand up for themselves. And frankly, after what happened with your pool, I've seen more people keeping to their own business than ever before. Maybe we all needed a wake-up call." Jamie stood there, processing what Steve had said. This was unexpected. He hadn't anticipated people actually backing him up, but it felt good, knowing that there were others who understood his need for boundaries. It felt like a small but important win in a battle he hadn't even realized was still going on. "Thanks, Steve," Jamie said, his tone genuine. "I appreciate you saying that." Steve nodded, then turned to leave, but not before giving Jamie one last piece of advice. "Just keep doing what you're doing. Don't let anyone walk all over you. It's your home. You've got every right to protect it." As Steve walked away, Jamie couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The tension had lifted. Maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. The next few weeks passed without incident. Jamie didn't get any more surprise visits or unwanted guests in his yard. The neighborhood returned to normal. And Sandra? Well, she kept her distance. Jamie knew the apology had been nothing more than a tactical move, but it didn't matter. She had learned the lesson he wanted her to learn. Don't mess with people's boundaries. One afternoon, as Jamie worked on his lawn, a car pulled up in front of his house. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized the familiar face of Sandra's husband, Greg. This was unexpected, but Jamie remained calm as Greg stepped out of the car and walked up to him. "Jamie," Greg said, his voice a little awkward. "I just wanted to apologize for everything that went down with Sandra in the pool. She's been, well, let's just say, she's not handling things well. But I know she went about it the wrong way. I talked to her about it. I just wanted to clear the air with you." Jamie leaned on his rake, considering Greg's words. "You're not the first one to come to me with an apology, but I appreciate it, Greg. This isn't about being right or wrong. It's about respecting each other. My pool, my rules." Greg nodded, seeming to understand. "You're right. You're absolutely right. And I'm sorry that it took all of this for people to realize that. We've been living here a long time, and I think some of us got a little too comfortable thinking we could just do whatever. I'll make sure Sandra doesn't pull anything like that again." Jamie gave him a nod of acknowledgement. "That's all I ask. Just respect." With that, Greg turned to leave. But before he got into his car, he stopped and glanced back at Jamie. "You know, it's funny," Greg said with a small grin. "I don't think anyone's ever had the guts to stand up to Sandra like that. You've got guts, man." Jamie smiled back, feeling the weight of the past few months finally lift. Sometimes, you just have to remind people who they're dealing with. As the days went on, things slowly returned to normal. Jamie could finally relax, knowing that his home, and his peace, was his again. Sandra stayed quiet, no longer testing his patience. The neighborhood, once tense and divided, seemed to settle into a new rhythm. People respected each other more, and Jamie could finally enjoy his quiet life again, free from the constant worry that someone might just take what wasn't theirs. In the end, it wasn't about winning. It was about standing up for what was right, about proving that boundaries, once established, are not to be crossed. And Jamie had done just that. He had fought for his peace, and in the end, he had reclaimed it. No one would ever forget that. The end.